Hello, my name is László Rózsa and I play recorder with Dunedin Consort. In this video I am going to talk a bit about my instrument, its history, its repertoire and its reputation, but before I dive into that I will play a little improvised prelude to set the tone and explore the timbre of the recorder. You might have noticed that the instrument I just played looks rather similar to this one. And from this one, we are actually just one step away from another recorder type, with which I am sure you all are pretty familiar with, the descant recorder in C. Now the slightly larger one is the treble in F, and both are prominent members of the recorder family. Before I get into why I am highlighting this resemblance, let's cover some fundamental differences. This one is a factory-made plastic instrument at A440 Hz, and this one is a handmade one built from granadilla wood and Siberian mammoth ivory, and it is tuned to A415 Hz. Now, of course, the intricacies of the inner bore and the voicing of the instruments are widely contrasting, but the basics of the design and the mechanism of the two are very similar. So why do I find this so important to emphasize? Firstly, because it shows that I can't quite provide a type of demonstration where I highlight that this is the well-known modern recorder, whereas here we have its historical relative that features regularly in period ensembles. In other words, I essentially started on a very similar instrument model to this one, and never had that moment in my musical studies where I somehow realized or have been made aware of the fact that certain repertoire might correspond more directly with an older variant of my instrument. So as for example a flautist moving to a traverso, a modern oboist picking up a baroque oboe, or a string player changing to a historical setup would not happen for most recorder players. This might seem like an obvious point, but it does make a rather important difference in how one approaches the repertoire of the instrument and how one perceives one's identity as an instrumentalist. So why is there no one firmly established modern recorder and an equivalent historical counterpart, and how did the recorder become such a key instrument in elementary music education? To find some answers to these questions, let's first cover some technicalities and a broad historical overview of the recorder. The basic sound production of the instrument is essentially the same as that of a whistle or the flue pipes of an organ. Air is blown into the windway, which directs it to the window of the instrument, where at the edge, called labium, the stream breaks, making part of it traveling above and part of it below. And this way we basically have a pipe resonating at a frequency determined by the pipe length. The mouthpiece is constricted and there is no solid moving part involved, like oboes which would have resonating reeds or the lips of a trumpet player. The length of the pipe is decided by the holes, so pitches result from different finger combinations. Now, these types of pipes have been present in many cultures since the dawn of time, but what singles out this particular instrument, the recorder, is the addition of a thumb hole and actually a seventh hole for the right hand little finger. The thumb hole essentially allows a smooth transition between the registers, so no overblowing is needed. This type of design, so thumb hole plus 7 playing holes, appeared in Europe roughly towards the end of the 14th century. From these times we don't really have any surviving functioning instruments. It was the 15th century that marked the construction of what we call now as the Renaissance recorder model, but from these times we actually also don't have functioning ones. It is the 16th century that provides us with the first actual surviving instruments and descriptions that aid us in understanding the nature of previous developments. Here are two examples that have been built in a similar vein. You can see that these have a plain and unornate appearance, are made out of one piece, and the sweet little detail is that the two holes at the bottom both have the same function, but one is filled with wax. The purpose of this is to make them equally playable for left and right-handed players. These instruments would have been primarily used as a consort, so different sizes from the same family playing together. The repertoire being 4, 5, 6-part compositions, mostly originally written for voices. The instrument I just played now is a tenor in C, but there was a full range of models from sopranos to great basses tuned to a broad variety of lowest notes. The first half of the 17th century marks, in terms of new paths in designs, a bit of an ebb in the history of the instrument, but the 1670s brought a new wave of developments. This is the point where the Baroque recorder construction started appearing, primarily as a result of French instrument makers. And here we are dealing with an ornate design with mostly a 3-part division: head, middle, and foot joint. At this point, the recorder repertoire mirrors the musical fashions of the time, thus being featured in sonatas, various chamber music setups, as part of the orchestra, or appearing as a concerto soloist. To mention some examples, Handel's sonatas, inclusion in operas like Acis and Galatea or Rinaldo, or his orchestral music like the Water Music, Purcell's stage works like King Arthur or Fairy Queen, or for that matter Lully's stage music too, concertos by Vivaldi, chamber music by Telemann, and also J.S. Bach's use of the instrument in about 20 cantatas, in 2 Brandenburg concertos, a harpsichord concerto, which is pretty much the same as Brandenburg 4, a short movement in the Matthew Passion, and the earlier version of his Magnificat, all mark key pieces of the repertoire. Now, by the latter part of the first half of the 18th century, the traverso had taken over much of the orchestral repertoire of the recorder, and after around the 1750s, the instrument increasingly faded out of mainstream professional music making, primarily due to the changing musical aesthetic ideals of the time, such as, for example, the heightening importance of dynamic shadings, something that really is not the biggest forte of the instrument. Thus, the period between roughly 1760 and 1840 does not mark such fundamental design changes in terms of the recorder as it has in the build of other instruments. So there is no 19th century boom system with the elaborate keywork enhancing chromaticism or equal semitones for us. On the side, I would like to mention that in the 19th century, and particularly in the first half of it, there were related instruments that flourished in amateur, even semi-professional, upper class and salon cultures. These would be the French and English flageolets or the chacans, popular in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The reawakening of the instrument began in the late 19th century. The figure of the French-born Arnold Dolmetsch, who immigrated to England, is especially important in the early stages of the revival. He had a wide-ranging interest in historical instruments and their repertoire, first focusing on harpsichords and viols, and soon afterwards on recorders too, which he built himself. The designs of his instruments were similar to historical Baroque models with slight alterations. He was a fascinating character altogether, well known in various artistic circles. So, for example, he was friends with William Morris, a prominent figure of the arts and crafts movement, and the writer George Bernard Shaw, who actually bought recorders from him, and he also received a brief mention in James Joyce's Ulysses. But how did recorders become so widespread after the mildly eccentric tendencies of early historical performance enthusiasts? After the First World War, several cultural educational movements started. Within this, the likes of Rudolf Steiner emphasized the importance of a simple wind instrument in primary music education, and simultaneously one of the leaders of the German youth movement, while seeking an instrument that would have some folk associations, was simple, intimate, seemingly not highly artistic and virtuosic, in the sense that it wouldn't be part of mainstream high music culture, found the recorder to be a good representation of such ideals. And similar educational tendencies could actually be observed in other parts of Europe too, including Holland, Switzerland, France, and also the UK, where the work of Edgar Hunt was central to recorders in education. Hand in hand with these tendencies, instrument production also began to increase. In Germany, Peter Harlan's workshop stood out, soon followed by the likes of Adler, Heinrich, Mollenauer and Möck. In England, Karl Dolmetsch, the son of Arnold, took over the workshop, who had a different aesthetic stance and saw the recorder primarily as a contemporary and educational instrument, and he also steered recorder making towards mass production, and later on also built plastic instruments. Now, following this, and soon after the Second World War, the plastic instrument production really picked up in Japan after the recorder became a school instrument in 1948. The first ones were made by Aulos, who continue to be prominent today, and other Japanese companies like Yamaha and Xenon are also leading providers. It is important to point out that besides new educational materials, there began a rise in art music compositions from the 20s onwards. This trend included pieces by Paul Hindemith, and in England the likes of Lennox Berkeley, Walter Lee, York Bowen and Gordon Jacob. However, much of this music is relatively unidiomatic for the instrument, is stylistically rather conservative, and often has a reminiscing character. The late 1950s and the 60s brought major changes to the repertoire, playing quality and instrument design. At this point, one simply cannot escape mentioning the figure of Franz Brüchen, who in his time actually achieved classical stardom status as a professional recorder player, and he inspired a huge amount of players attempting to follow his path. His activities, on one hand, tied in strongly with the growing historical performance movement, and this led to a revival of original instruments and to an active and fruitful dialogue with outstanding instrument makers who started to measure and copy historical originals. On the other hand, Brüchen was also keen to open a dialogue with avant-garde composers in order to build a new professional repertoire for the instrument, and this resulted in cornerstone pieces including works by Rob Dubois, Louis Andriessen and Luciano Berio, utilizing challenging but idiomatic figures and newly explored extended techniques of the instrument. Now, ever since, the growth of new music for the instrument has been immense, and in the past 60 years or so, there have been more original compositions written for the recorder than ever before. To demonstrate this, I will play a short excerpt from a piece from 2000, and in here you will hear some extended techniques, including multiphonics, so more than one note sounding at the same time, various glissandos, so a smooth sliding between notes, flattetongue, a long rolled R sound, and a variety of vibratos, amongst other things. So at the end of the day, recorder players are often facing intriguingly recurring dualities when it comes to the narrative of their instruments. The juxtaposition of amateur and professional cultures and historical and contemporary repertoire. The instrument design has recently been going more actively hand in hand with the old and new repertoire narrative, some seeing the Baroque model as a peak of design even for contemporary repertoire, and others striving for new paths in which key characteristics, or weaknesses if you like, of the old design are altered, thus enhancing chromaticism and dynamics. The classroom use of the recorder persists in many places, which to this day results in the regular after-concert scenario of audience members expressing their surprise that one can be a professional recorder player. Now, I don't mean to argue against the broad educational use of the recorder. In fact, I find it is indeed an excellent starting instrument, but just like singing, it perhaps deserves a status in which it can be recognized as something that can serve as a fundament of encountering music, but at the same time its wide-ranging expressive possibilities are not in question. Judging by the flourishing standard of today's professional recorder playing, I think we might be on a good course towards this. Or perhaps rebelling against certain stereotypes will and should remain part of this dialogue, so that the fire, hunger and drive of recorder players is kept alive by this.